So this is Plantagenet, the latest in the Levy and campaign series of games that began with Nevsky. This is set in the Wars of the Roses, 15th century Britain, and I'm going to do a series of short little videos of a playthrough of a simple three-turn scenario, which is titled Somerset's Return, and perhaps give a sense about how this really fantastic seeming game plays. So what's the historic context of this? Well, we're in 1464, shortly after the decisive battle of Towton. Henry VI, Lancastrian king formerly, has lost that battle and has been exiled up to Scotland. You can see here the exile marker. It's an interesting feature of Plantagenet that hasn't appeared elsewhere, and I'll come to what exile means. Suffice to say, there are a number of exile boxes across the map, Burgundy being one of them, which is the exile place of sanctuary for the Yorkists, and Scotland, where the Lancastrians are placed. And he is up against the new Yorkist king, Edward of March, now Edward IV, here in London, with his benefactor, the powerful Warick. Let's take a look at the map quickly. There are three different types of strongholds. Cities like Oxford, with the, I suppose, the big church spire or tower. We have towns, an example being Northampton here, slightly smaller. And then we also have strongholds, an example being down here, Pembroke. There are also three special locations which kind of fall between all of them: Harlech, London under here, and Calais down here, all of which have implications for scoring and other gameplay effects. The strongholds are connected by highways, which are these grey roads, the brown ones, and tracks, which if you come over to places like Wales, the remoter parts, these green routes as well. So then what about all these pieces of cardboard? Well, let's take this as an example of the first type. This is a home seat for one of the lords who are involved in the scenario. So this is Somerset's home seat in Wells. The other Lancastrian, Richard, has his home seat in London, though he's not there at the moment. The home seat for Warick is down here in Carlisle. And Edward of March, his is up here in Ludlow. You'll also see these little tokens, the white and the red roses. These indicate favour at the various individual towns and are a significant part of the game. We'll come to more about that later. Gaining favour is very important. And then let's take an example here of Oxford. These are vassals. There are 13 of them that can be levied at certain points. 2 tokens, one goes on a player's mat and one goes on the calendar to track their period of service. So how do you win the game? Well, victory is determined by who has the most influence points, which are tracked along this track around the side of the map. Depending on the scenario, there is a threshold to reach. In this instance, it's 25 points. At the moment, the game begins with the Lancastrians at 6 points. Influence is also not simply victory points, but also a form of currency. And as you take a variety of actions, you spend influence, so your influence track can move up or down depending on how much you're spending. There are a number of ways of gaining influence, by and large by controlling strongholds, winning in battle, having a general presence at certain points towards the end of the round. So there's a sort of a constant push me, pull you between gaining points but also having to spend influence points to take the actions you want to take. It's a fascinating part of the game. Finally, let's take a look at a individual lord's mat. So these are sort of blank mats which you overlay with the lord's card. Lords have the usual levy and campaign ratings, influence, which is a new one actually, lordship, command, valour, which comes into effect during battle. This is their starting forces. The pieces are up here. Their assets, provender, coin and ships or carts. Those are the only 2 types of transport. And then just notice these 2. Every lord begins with a retinue, which is a kind of supercharged sort of a standard force that kind of follows them everywhere, but you don't want to lose them. If you lose your retinue, you are in trouble. And then your vassals. In this instance, Montague is a special vassal triggered by this the play of this card, but otherwise you can acquire the vassals from the map. They are also a form of supercharged troop, which you place on the map. So the first levy phase of the first turn, 2 cards drawn by each side, in this instance for the capabilities, which is the bottom half of these cards. They have to be played by a lord that is mustered. We do the rebels first, that's the Lancastrian, and these 2 cards, actually they're very similar, chamberlains and quartermasters. One allows lords supply and levy of troops to be done without depleting the stronghold at his or her vassal's seats, and equally quartermasters allows the lord to levy troops without depleting or exhausting a stronghold. Now those terms will be made clear later. The only lord on the map at the moment for the Lancastrians is Somerset, so he has to take both of them, and we tuck them under his mat accordingly. The Yorkists draw their 2 Arts of War cards. This one, Beloved Warick, has to be, because of the symbol, has to be assigned to Warick. So that has to go to him. No option, but it means he can levy troops for 5 militia instead of the stronghold's listed troops. So militia are the brown troops, these ones here, slightly cannon fodder, so that may or may not be useful. He's now got his 2 cards, so Scourers has to be assigned to March. This lord's forage actions always add 1 extra provender, so when we're foraging for food, normally it provides you with 1 provender. In this instance, because of Scourers, that's going to get another. That's not particularly powerful, but it doesn't seem to me. But anyway, that's that phase finished. On the first turn of any scenario, we now skip the pay phase, so we'll come to that when we get to the next turn. But we then move to the exiles and vassals stage. So at this point, any lord who is on the calendar with an exile marker on top of him can be mustered into the exile box. The Lancastrians, when they are returned to exile, come in at Scotland. So that's an automatic, no dice roll, no nothing. He is automatically mustered. That's former Henry VI. His marker, his board is over here, and so I can at this point top up his required troops and food and a retinue marker, and he will now be in place to come back on to the map. Before getting into the meat of the game, a whistle-stop tour of how you gain and lose influence points. Now you spend them for taking an influence check, and that's done whenever you carry out attempts to place favour. The parley action, which places favour at various locations, or if you try to levy a new lord. You lose them if your troops are ever unfed or unpaid and you have to pillage the location you're in. You lose them too if you go into exile. Conversely, if you win a battle, you gain influence points depending on the influence rating of your opponent. And then at the end of each round we have the Tides of War, when you gain influence points if you've got lords up in the regions in Scotland, Wales or the south, or if you have dominance of those regions. And then whoever has control of the most number of cities or the most number of towns or the most number of fortresses also gains influence points. And there's a few other small ways of gaining them, but that broadly speaking is how they are gained and lost. So what about some of the strategies? There's no point both sides sitting back. It would just lead to a stalemate in terms of how points are gained at the end of the round in the Tides of War phase. The Lancastrians will gain it because of their influence, strength, and the Yorkists because of their control of Calais and London, and that will even each other out. So I think what the Lancastrians have to do once they've gathered enough strength and got Henry back onto the map proper and out of exile is push south perhaps to control these currently, or not control, gain favour in these currently sort of neutral areas here, And I think the Yorkists, who have a little bit more strength, though it's fairly even, will possibly see if they can gain some vassals, an option open to the Lancastrians too, of course, and push north themselves and perhaps bring things to a culminating battle. So we now come to the muster phase, beginning with the rebels, in this instance the Lancastrians. Now they have the following options. They can carry out a influence check to parley with a stronghold, either to flip the flavour from one from their opposing side to neutral, or take turn a neutral stronghold into their favour. They can check influence to ready to muster a lord if one is ready. In this scenario, that's not applicable. They can check influence to levy a vassal who is at a stronghold that favours them. They can also levy troops if they're at a stronghold that is unexhausted, and they can levy transport if they want. And finally, they can acquire a capability card. So let's see which of these we use. So now we come to the muster phase, beginning with the Lancastrians. Henry has 2 lordships, so he can muster twice. First, he's going to muster Margaret, the capability, which will give him +2 points every tides of war while we're outside London. Now he's going to try and muster Westmoreland, the vassal, who is at a loyal or friendly location. That costs 1 point. He can choose to spend another point to bump up his influence rating, but it's already at 5, so there's no point doing that. If Westmoreland had a number in the left-hand side, that would be a loyalty rating to one side or the other. That would affect the die roll. It doesn't apply here. So he's going to need to roll less than or equal to his influence, which is 5. He rolls a 2, so that is successful. Westmoreland, 1 piece is placed on the calendar, 3 steps ahead because he has a rating of 3, and the other goes onto Henry's mat. So successfully mustered Westmoreland as his vassal. Somerset now musters. He's going to begin by levying some troops at the stronghold of Bamborough. Normally that action would deplete the location, and then once you do a similar action at the a depleted location, it would become exhausted, and it then can't be tapped for resources from then onwards. However, because of his quartermaster's capability, he's allowed to levy troops without depleting or exhausting, so that's really quite powerful. So he's going to levy some troops, which will be a men-at-arms and a strongbowman. He now has 3 of each, and then he is going to try to parley with York. That costs 1 influence for the action, and then 1 for each way between where he is and his destination, so another 2 ways, so that's going to cost 3. So now the influence check against his rating of 5, he needs a 5 or less to be successful. He rolls a 1. York rallies to the Lancastrian cause. Let's just take a quick look at what the Lancastrian muster phase has done to the influence track. It began the scenario +6 in the Lancastrian favour in terms of influence points. Cities were at +2 in favour of the Yorkists. They had favour at 2 more cities than the Lancastrians. Richard took an influence check for 1 point when he mustered the vassal Westmoreland. Somerset has now just tried an influence check of his own to parley with York. That cost 1 point for the basic action itself, and then he had to spend another influence point for each of the ways in between his location, Bamborough, and York itself. So that cost a further 2 influence points. It was successful, and as a result, we move this marker now to show that the balance in favour of the Yorkists in terms of favour at cities has now dropped from 2 to just 1. So we move to the Yorkists. Warick is going to muster first. He's going to initially, he's got his eyes on Oxford, so he's going to attempt to parley with Oxford. That's going to cost 1 for the action, 1 influence point for the way in between. He's got a rating of 5, so he needs a 5 or less. He rolls a 4. So Oxford, like the other strongholds around it, comes on board with the Yorkists. Now a second influence check to see if he can levy the Earl of Oxford. Again, that's going to cost 2 influence points, so we're back up to +6 influence points for the Lancastrians. A 1 means that Oxford has been summoned to the cause and he joins Warick. 1 marker is placed 2 boxes ahead on the calendar, 1 on the March, or Edward IV as we know him, musters now. He's going to play York's favoured son, slightly ironic seeing as how the Lancastrians have just gained favour at York, but anyway, York's favoured son will give him a +1 influence, which is currently low at only 2, so that'll bump up to 3, and +1 command, so he'll get 3 commands. So that's his first, and then he and Warick are pretty low on transport, so he can muster transport, and when you muster transport or levy transport at a friendly locale, you can claim ships, or as he's going to do, 2 carts with which they will be able to move their provender around the country. With that, the levy phase ends and we'll move into the first campaign phase. Just before we move into the command phase, I've just got to rectify a slight error. I'd forgot to notice that Warick has 3 lordship, therefore he can take 3 actions in the levy phase. So what he's going to do is, at the cost of 2 influence points, attempt to gain favour in St Albans. He rolls a 3, that's successful, so we put favour down at St Albans. And now the Yorkists are leading in terms of favour in towns. I now plan, or go into the planning phase for each faction. I take their command cards, there's 3 for each of my lords available. I create a deck of those which stipulate the order in which I want my the lords to act. So because it's at the autumn term, each will choose 4 cards, and I'll create those decks before we move into the commands themselves. Henry is first up. He has 2 command points and he's going to take the march action. So let's take a look at how march works. When you march, you can move a lord to an adjacent stronghold from where he is by a way. You can carry with you 1 piece of provender for every cart you have. And there are rules around marshals, which are special lords who can take other lords with them. It costs you 1 action to move along 2 sections of highway. It costs you 1 action to move along 1 section of road, and it costs you your entire card to move along a path. So to move from Appleby to Lancaster would cost you your entire card. So Henry could take a move for 1 command point and then combine it with another type of action for his second. So having looked at how march works, now we come to Henry's actual action. He wants to leave exile in Scotland. Now, there's 2 things he could do. If he had ships, he could come out by sea, but in fact he's going to come by land. There are 2 land routes out of Scotland, 1 down to Carlisle and 1 to Bamborough, which is where he's going to head to join up with Somerset. And these arrows, you may be able to see, are green, therefore they are paths. It's going to use up the entire card for that movement out of Scotland. So he moves to Bamborough, at which point you have to, or you can, if you want to remind yourself, mark him with a moved token. So he now has to feed his troops. You have to feed 1 piece of provender for every 6 troops you have on your board. Henry has 8 troops, therefore he's going to have to feed 2 pieces of provender, which he has, but it's meant he's spent all his provender now. The first Yorkist card now is Warick. They're slightly hamstrung, the Yorkists, by the fact they've only got 3 carts, so they can only carry 3 provender between them. So I think they're going to be slightly hamstrung this first turn until they can levy more transports next time round. Warick has 2 command points, so what he's going to do for his first is he's going to march, and because you can see this ring around him, he's a lieutenant and he can take with him another lord who's at his location. So for his first command point, they're going to march up to Cambridge along these 2 highways. We will remember to feed them. For his second action, he's going to parley at Cambridge. That's an automatic success when you do it at the location where you're at. So that gets a Yorkist flag. And now the 10 troops that they have there, that's going to require 2 bits of provender. March feeds with one of his. Warick feeds with one of his, and that's the end of their turn. Henry is next up again for the Plantagenets, and he's going to supply. Now, when you supply, you must be in a friendly location and supply from a friendly location that you can trace a route to through a series of friendly locations. So, for example, Henry could supply from Bamborough for one action, or he could supply from York because he could trace a route through Newcastle. Now, cities provide a bit more supply and provender than strongholds. If you wanted to supply from, let's say, Newcastle, he would need, because there's a single route between them, he would need one cart for every piece of provender he drew from Newcastle. So if he drew 2 pieces of provender from Newcastle, he would need 2 carts. Every time you supply, you deplete that location. The second time you supply, you exhaust and can no longer use that as a source. In this instance, Henry is going to supply once to deplete and then twice to exhaust Bamborough, providing him with 2 pieces of provender. Now it's Warick up for the Yorkists. He too is going to need to supply. He's going to supply from St Albans, sort of drawing food from locations further south as he moves further north. He uses the carts that March has, so he can draw upon March's carts to use his 2 commands for 2 supply actions from St Albans. The first time he does that, depletes it. He uses one of the carts that March has to get the first piece of supply. St Albans as a town will provide 1 piece of supply each time. Then the second time he supplies from St Albans with his second command point, he exhausts it, but that provides him with 2 pieces of provender to top them up ahead of a further march north at a later point. Somerset is up next. Now, he is going to march. It's a bit risky. He's a lieutenant. Henry is a marshal. Lieutenants can't carry marshals with them. The marshals can carry lieutenants. They're senior. So, for one command, his first of 2, he can march down 2 highways to York. It's potentially risky because he could open himself up to an attack, a 2-to-1 attack. But anyway, we'll see. I'm not sure that will emerge. For his second command, he's going to Parley and Lincoln. 1 influence point for the action, 1 for the intervening way. So influence points drop to +2 for the Lancastrians. He needs to avoid a 6. We must remember, of course, to mark him for having moved. That's successful. Lincoln shows its favour to the Lancastrian cause, and we pay for his movement. So next up for the Yorkists is March. That's precisely what he's going to do to begin with. He's going to march for his first command. He has 3 commands because of the York's favoured son capability card, which gives him a +1 command. So he's got 3 commands. So for his first command, he's going to march. Now, he doesn't have any food at the moment, so he's going to have to supply. But before that, for his second command, he is going to parley in Ely. That is automatically a success because he's at the location. So that is now favourable. Ely is now favourable. And finally, now that it is favourable, he can supply quite easily. It's a city. It will provide 2 pieces of provender. There we are. It becomes depleted, not yet exhausted, and he spends one of those provender to pay for having moved, and so the surplus 1 piece goes onto his mat. For the Lancastrians' final card, Henry up, 2 commands. First command, marches 2 highway steps. So he's going to need feeding. He has 8 troops, so he's going to need 2 bits of provender. So he also has 2 carts, so he can supply from Newcastle, the city of Newcastle. With his 2 carts, that gives him enough to draw 2 bits of provender from Newcastle. Those 2 bits of provender automatically are used to feed his 8 troops. Newcastle is depleted, and we're going to see whether all this depletion matters. Maybe not this turn, maybe not the next turn, but possibly in the 3rd turn, when it could have dire consequences and force lords into the drastic action of pillaging. Warick is the last command. He's at Ely, so for his first action of 2 he's going to move up to join his king. He's going to have to feed himself in a minute. And then for his second command, between them, he and March have 3 carts. That allows them to trace a route, the 3 routes to London. They will supply from London. That's going to give him 3 provender. It's going to deplete London. It's not yet exhausted. May as well do it before the supply chain gets too long. Warick now has 6 pieces of food, but he's got nothing to carry it with, so he's going to have to muster something in the levy phase or see that food go to waste. And that brings the campaign to an end. We'll now move into the end campaign stage. So now we come to the tides of war, when influence points are awarded for a variety of things. First, you get a point if you have a lord in either the North, Wales or the South. There are no lords in any of those regions. You then get +2 if you dominate any of those 3 regions. That means having favour in all of the strongholds. So that's +2 for the Lancastrians in the north, +2 cancelling out for the Yorkists in the south. The Yorkists get +2 for London and +2 for Calais. The Lancastrians +1 for Harlech, so that's a net +3 for those 3 locations for the Yorkists. The Yorkists get +2 for having most cities in favour. They get +1 for having most towns in their favour. The Lancastrians get 1 in return for having most fortresses in their favour. The Margaret card gives +2 to the Lancastrians. Then the Yorkists get +8 for their influence ratings on their 2 lords. The Lancastrians get +10 for a net +2. That ends the tides of war phase. To clean up, if there were any lords at sea, they would disembark. Some of them might be shipwrecked, but that doesn't apply. If anybody had reached the victory threshold, we would award the victory at that point. Well, the threshold is 25, and at the moment the Lancastrians are at +3, having started the scenario at +6. If we were in August and September, we would have the grow phase, in which depleted areas are flipped down back to full strength, and exhausted areas are flipped back to depleted. Waste, which should happen in this season, but not in this scenario. You'd see lords having to get rid of some of their assets if they've got too many of them, and then we reset, move into turn 6, and that is the end of 1 full round of Plantagenet.